Hello and welcome to Sunday Politics with me, Tara Mills. Another week of revealing testimony at the COVID-19 inquiry. The Chief Medical Officer gave his evidence on Friday.
And all I was doing was providing the professional advice, but I was increasingly aware and anxious that my professional advice had become a dividing line within the executive.
100 days of the new Assembly. What changes have you noticed? We'll ask the Party of Opposition how they feel the new executive is performing. In the Republic, there's no end in sight to the growing migrants crisis. We'll have the latest from Dublin. And he's been covering the COVID inquiry. We'll hear his analysis shortly. The Ireland editor of the Press Association, David Young. Hello there. The man in charge of advising the Stormont executive on health during COVID-19 has said the attendance of senior Sinn Féin figures at the funeral of Bobby Storey caused hurt and anger and could have undermined public confidence. Professor Sir Michael McBride was giving evidence on Friday and made clear to the inquiry how challenging he found dealing with the pandemic. Here's some of what he told the inquiry on Friday.
We headed into this pandemic with a less resilient health and social care system, budgetary uncertainty, significant workforce challenges and vacancies, a system that was long overdue for change. My role and the role of the Chief Scientific Advisor was to provide advice. We provided that advice, but the medical and scientific advice was only but one aspect of the many other factors that ministers needed to consider and the executive needed to consider before arriving at a decision.
It's very clear, isn't it, from the examples that we've seen, that your role wasn't one of independence, and that you did on occasions veer not just into directing or involving yourself in the work of the executive office, but we've seen here an example of something that's really overtly political.
I genuinely do not accept the characterisation about inserting myself into the role of the executive office. I wouldn't underestimate the pressures that I was experiencing at that time to change my view, change my professional advice, and all I was doing was providing the professional advice, but I was increasingly aware and anxious that my professional advice had become a dividing line within the executive.
I think it's clear certainly from the messages that you sent in and around this time that it was an extremely difficult meeting, and that tensions at it were extremely high.
That's correct, yeah.
And in fact, what you went on to say, certainly on the 10th of November, I won't bring it up on screen, but you said that it was disgraceful and that they should all hang their heads in shame in respect of the ministers. Is that right?
I mean, I think the second part of that WhatsApp is the relevant bit, which is putting it in the context of the consequences, which I was reflecting on a 46 or 49-year-old man saying goodbye to his children on FaceTime. So, I think...
Take your time, someone.
Yes. And
my sense was the need to understand the consequences of decisions.
The funeral that took place on the 30th of June 2020, which was attended by the Deputy First Minister and I think 2 other ministers, can you provide your view or opinion as to what impact that might have had at the time?
Anything whereby those of us in a position of public profile and who were leading response to the pandemic or contributing to leading the response, anything which suggested that there was one rule for us and a different rule for someone else, I think was extremely problematic. My concern was that and the other incidents where this occurred created a great deal of hurt, anger, and also had the potential to undermine public confidence.
The Chief Medical Officer there. Let's reflect on that with my guest, David Young. It's interesting because there are kind of key names that most people are interested in hearing. Sir Michael McBride, definitely one of those. But by the end of Friday, what sense did you get of how the questions were put to him? Because it's such a short amount of time the lawyers have to interview each of the witnesses.
I think that was probably my main takeaway from not only Friday, but for the inquiry to date. It's almost the truncated nature of it. It's almost a whistle-stop tour through the main events of the pandemic. We saw from those clips the breadth and the sheer number of key issues that the Chief Medical Officer was questioned on. But obviously he only had one day in the stand and one day to give evidence. So by the nature of that, the time spent on each of those huge issues individually was pretty limited. There were occasions where he was in the middle of an answer, but counsel to the inquiry, through no fault of her own, because she's obviously working within time constraints, had to sort of push him on to the next part of the evidence. And even at the end of the evidence, it didn't end there. There were questions still outstanding, but the chair of the inquiry said, that's enough for today. And it's not like a criminal trial or anything where he would come back the next day to continue his evidence. That's him done, essentially, for the COVID inquiry. So I think what we may see come the end of this process, 3 weeks of evidence here in Northern Ireland, maybe 12 days in total, is will we see more calls or further calls for potentially a Northern Ireland specific inquiry where we can delve a bit deeper into these issues?
Yeah, because he denied that suggestion that he was overtly political. I mean, he was very high profile during the pandemic. He was sort of front and centre. Do you think that there are matters to be investigated there that we're just not getting the time to look at in depth?
Well, I think the evidence spoke to the sort of the chaotic and intensive nature of things. Certainly in the very opening of the pandemic, and how there's that interaction between not only Dr. McBride and his minister, but also between the wider executive and the executive office, and those relations were explored. But again, that was maybe half the morning was devoted to that topic, where some people may say that topic in itself requires a more weighty investigation in regard to what happened. And we saw almost partial bits of evidence. We were given emails that Dr. McBride said this, but we didn't actually hear from the other person on the side of the chain, and senior officials, and they aren't really being brought in. They've obviously given statements, but their evidence isn't being challenged. So you almost get a sort of a partial picture of what happened.
What about this week then? What are you looking out for?
So this week, again, we have 4 days of evidence. We have the Health Minister, we have Michelle O'Neill, who then Deputy First Minister, and Baroness Foster, then First Minister. But again, for instance, the Health Minister's up on Monday, but he doesn't even have the full day of evidence. There are 2 other witnesses on Monday. So, from an objective point of view, some may ask, is that sufficient time to question the minister who was in charge of the health response to COVID for the entirety of the pandemic, 3/4 of a day?
David, very interesting to hear your thoughts on that. Stay with us. We'll talk more to you later in the programme. Well, let's move from who did what during the pandemic to the here and now. It's 100 days since the Assembly was restored. Plenty of visuals to talk about, but what about the substance so far? I'm joined now by the SDLP MLA, Colin McGrath. Good to have you on the programme. I mean, 100 days, when I talk about the visuals, you think of some of the high-profile events attended by, both the First and Deputy First Ministers, the Education Minister, things that have kind of symbolised a slight shift in gear. But from your point of view, how has the new executive been performing?
Well, I think we were prepared as an opposition to give the executive time to bed in, to be able to settle into its new role. We're now, as you say, approaching 100 days from that has happened. And I just don't think that they're now cutting it. I think we've seen plenty of the photo ops, but we're not seeing much of the substance. And if we look at why there was an absolute urgent need to have the executive back, it was because we had issues to do with public sector pay. We need to see issues addressed for affordable childcare. We need to see hospital waiting lists reduced. And here we are after 100 days, and we don't have a shred of evidence that any of those issues are going to be adequately dealt with.
Do you think your party has had enough time to try to put forward some of those key issues? Give us a sense of what you're going to do tomorrow.
Well, what we have now are opposition days, being an official opposition, which is slightly different in this Assembly from others. So we have those protected days where we can set the agenda. But it's not that it's the SDLP setting the agenda. We're doing it in working with sectors on the ground. They're coming to us and telling us where they feel that this executive is not delivering for them, where they want to see delivery, and we're amplifying that through our opposition days. So we have had debates on dealing with poverty. We're calling for that programme for government. We want to see an environmental protection agency which could deal with issues in Lough Neagh. So we're trying to amplify those issues to put them on the agenda of this executive, because currently it's failing to prioritise them.
I mean, let's go back just on the programme for government. It's been quite some time, even before the previous suspension, that we've had one in place. It's key to the accountability so that kind of voters can look at it at come election time and say, well, how much of this did they actually progress? Are you confident that you'll see it? Michelle O'Neill kind of batted the last question from the SDLP away about this.
Well, certainly, I had asked about the programme for government recently and was told by Michelle O'Neill, let's not be in a hurry. But again, that doesn't cut it if you're looking at your monthly bills and your money has been taken away because you can't afford childcare. If you're languishing on a waiting list for this last 6 years and you hear that your executive is not in a hurry to address those issues, it's very concerning. That's why we will be putting a programme for government front and centre tomorrow in our opposition day to see where it is. That programme of government should then deliver a legislative agenda that various departments will then follow. And we can scrutinise that as an opposition. But at the minute, we haven't seen a single piece of legislation of any substance. The only piece of legislation that we've seen in the Assembly in the first 100 days was to overturn a piece of legislation that they had passed in the last Assembly. So this is an executive that is trailing its heels. It's not doing its job. And our job as an opposition is to expose that and to ask for that delivery, because that's what people need to see.
What about the budget then? I mean, obviously there was disagreement over that, so it doesn't particularly augur well, but it does put a lot of pressure on the SDLP in terms of opposition. There was some suggestion the Ulster Unionist Party may have come and joined you. That kind of went away within a couple of days. What sort of pressure can you put on realistically? Because come the next election, people will be wanting to see what you've delivered.
Well, what we will deliver, and we've made this, we said we would be constructive in opposition. That means that we're going to try and highlight where we feel that there are inadequacies in the decisions that are being taken. It's the sectors on the ground, it's people on the doorsteps that are telling us that. So we're raising the issue so that the executive doesn't fall into a bubble where it thinks it's doing a great job, but forgets to go out and ask people and ask the sectors what's happening. In terms of a budget, we will critically assess that budget to make sure that the priorities are correct. I know that certainly collectively on the Health Committee, which I sit on, we've been asking the Health Minister to give us his priorities. Where is he spending the money so that we can determine is it being spent in the right place? And we still haven't got that sort of information. So we do need to see more transparency in terms of the budget to see where the priorities are. But that fits in with the programme for government. That fits in with a legislative programme. And we're not seeing any of that, and we're going to be 100 days or more this week and nothing. So we need to put pressure to have that programme for government delivered.
So is there a different way of doing it? Because if you look at what's happening with health, I mean, Robin Swann potentially won't even be the health minister for that much longer, depending on what happens with the election. So you're going to have a change of personality there. You're on the health committee. The urgency over health, it feels like it's urgent on the outside, but it feels like much more of the same from what's coming from the Assembly so far.
And also, we need to not fall into the trap that it's Robin Swann or it's the Ulster Unionist. This is an executive that has a health department that it runs. A finance department needs to give its money to the health department to be able to deliver the work that it sets as a priority.
But transforming the care surely is the key. None of this is just a money pot that will continue to need to be filled up unless there is significant reform, and we're not really hearing that at all.
Well, and you're preaching to the converted about needing to see transformation in our health services being the key issue that will actually deliver the system and deliver the money for the future. But we don't have that transformation. Our minister tells us that there isn't the money for the transformation. And if there isn't the money from the finance department, that tells me that this executive is not putting its will behind transformation, which is going to deliver the change in the health service that we need. But that could replicate across every other department. We don't know what their priorities are. It's like they've got a secret programme for government and they're just not telling us what it is. We need to see it. We need to be able to assess it. We need to be able to go out to the sectors on the ground, listen to what people are saying, and then articulate that back to the executive.
Well, obviously, none of the executive parties is here to defend their position, and I'm sure they would say that they are working very hard in the background on the programme for government. When you look at what's been happening in the COVID inquiry, and we heard from David there, we heard from Sir Michael McBride, I'm sure you've been watching as well. You did have an executive minister at the time. It feels that ministers and senior civil servants aren't coming out particularly well. It feels that, once again, there are echoes of RHI, that we're not particularly well served as a population.
Yeah, and it almost feels like that sort of WikiLeaks, where every night you would get this mass amount of information which showed who was sort of calling who names and who wasn't doing something, who wanted to blame the other side for what was happening. But that was in the middle of a global pandemic, a public health emergency. And what we're now saying is that many of our ministers were spending time calling each other names rather than dealing with the issues that were being presented. And if we looked at the dysfunctionality that there was previously that the RHI inquiry had highlighted, it gave a whole series of recommendations which we wanted to see implemented. Then we got to COVID a number of years later, and it looks like there was no change. And the problem is that we're now in a COVID inquiry. So the worry is there going to be recommendations from this that this executive is not going to follow up?
But in terms of the SDLP, because it's all very well to criticise, but you did have a minister, as I said, you had Nicola Mallon there. And then the election comes and she loses her seat. So there was definitely a problem with the SDLP in their operation of the executive as far as the electorate and that constituency were concerned.
And I know that Nicola Mallon was deeply frustrated, where she wanted to make some positive changes within that executive, but would come out deeply frustrated because of the rows, the arguments and the inability to take decisions. And that goes to the core of the dysfunctionality that there is between the two lead parties. When you put these two lead parties into government together, it's dysfunction. We found that in RHI. We're now finding that out from COVID. And why do we not have a programme for government? Why do we not have a legislative agenda? Why do we not have a shred of legislation going through the executive after 100 days through the Assembly? I think it's because that same dysfunctionality is still there. We need to have the mechanisms that prevent that dysfunctionality from occurring.
So is the SDLP in opposition one step? Would you like to see Alliance and Ulster Unionists join you and have a slightly different form of opposition? Because what you're saying is repeated time and time again and has been over the years, but yet the electorate don't seem to be turned off by that dysfunction as you see it.
Well, I do think there's a disconnect between the functions of the executive and election campaigns, and that's something for an election time that we will hopefully be able to address. But certainly for ourselves, we're focused on what we're doing in opposition, and that is listening to people on the ground, the sectoral groups that are telling us where they're not getting representations, where they're seeing the frustrations day and daily to do with poverty, to do with childcare, to do with other issues, and we're making sure that we put forward that clearly, concisely on the floor of the Assembly in the hope that we can push that executive to start making decisions.
Just a very quick question on what's been happening with the journalists and the court case this week. Are you concerned about how the PSNI has operated?
Absolutely. Look, one of the cornerstones of a democracy is that we have a free press, that they can challenge government, that they can challenge public bodies about the decisions that they take. It is very worrying that there were surveillance operations going on here by a police force to try in some way frustrate the exposure of collusion by police force. I just don't think that that's acceptable. I think we need to get to the bottom of it. When I think that one of those issues of collusions was to do with Loughlin Island in my own constituency, and we have the 30th anniversary of that next month, to think that there was collusion by police force as far up as a couple of years ago in trying to frustrate that process, deeply concerning. We need to see the policing board address this to make sure that it stops and that there's no occurrence of it. But I do think we need to see an inquiry so that we can have faith that our police are not trying to prevent the press from doing their work.
OK, Colin, thanks very much indeed. Thanks for coming on the programme. Now let's turn to the Republic now and the crisis surrounding shelter for asylum seekers and other migrants. The focus has been on Dublin city centre, but other regions have also had issues. Darren Marshall was in Ballina for The View, and here's a taste of some of the people he spoke to.
Ballina is full because we haven't the services, full stop. If we had the services, of course we'd welcome everybody and that they're able to work and spend their money here, that they have their money to spend. It's very complicated in so many ways, and I'm not saying no to anybody if they were from Timbuktu, it doesn't matter.
Basically, where we are right now is we have way too many asylum seekers in the country. Maybe not even, well, they're not asylum seekers, a lot of them. We, Irish people and us as a community, have no problem with the genuine asylum seekers. But the problem here is now a lot of people coming into the country are economic migrants. They're also undocumented.
Immigration is a hot topic on the doorstep at the moment. And I think a symptom of it is the housing crisis that we have.
People feel that they're not being listened to and they're not being heard of. What they wanted to have done, the people in the town, is if people are coming into the town, they're very welcome, but there needs to be an assessment of needs. And then there needs to be an audit of needs to see if the town has the resources to meet those needs.
There's Darren Marshall reporting from County Mayo, but the issue is at its most raw in the capital. Villages of tents have popped up in several areas of Dublin, and dealing with asylum seekers is increasingly going to be a key talking point in the council elections south of the border. Let's talk to Conal Thomas, political correspondent with the Business Post. Good to have you on the programme. Bring us up to date, because we've seen a lot of shifting, attempts to move people along, and then these tented villages popping up, a few hundred metres away. What's the latest you can bring us from Dublin today?
Yeah, thanks, Dara. I suppose the situation around tents emerged first around Mount Street, which the International Protection Office is in Dublin. Now, that would have gone back to March. They were cleared March 17th, but they've gradually come back. And when Simon Harris took the Taoiseach's office, he made it very clear. He said there would be no more tent villages, as it were, whatever you want to call it, in the city centre. They were removed. However, asylum seekers, international protection applicants came back. They were moved. They moved then onto the canal. More tents were put up. They were then removed, and we've seen effectively fencing erected now in the last few days to prevent more people coming in with tents, which I should say the tents are being handed out by the government, because the Department of Integration Minister Roderick O'Gorman has said he does not want to see people destitute, while at the same time the government are the ones that are now removing these tents. So it's this ongoing situation, and really I would describe the situation politically, given we're only 4 weeks out from the local and European elections on June 7th, as febrile. I mean, on the one hand, you have a coalition government trying to get ahead of this. There's been a lot of criticism from Sinn Féin, the opposition, that they haven't got ahead of it in time. You have misinformation creeping in, and we're only 4 weeks out now from the local and European elections. So it's quite a critical time, I think, for the government.
Conal, I just want to sort of look at some of the figures, because it does feel that this has shifted somewhat from a kind of far-right argument to something that is affecting a lot of people in the Republic. 87 people arriving every day, according to official figures. That's in the month of May. It was about 57 a day, according to official figures in April. On top of that, the tens of thousands of people are already there. It's a real difficult dilemma for the government and for all of the parties, because if you look at somewhere like Ballina, once there's an attempt to move people into accommodation that is available, there's a public protest. And then if you put them into tents, it just feels, to watch those pictures of the lack of sanitation, and there's a dehumanising impact of those villages of tents. Is it something that the parties need to come together to address here? Is this really an election issue?
I think it is. I mean, well, there's a couple of things. I mean, I think, we have to be very careful around the normalisation almost of people in tents. I mean, it seems bizarre to have gone from this situation in the short space of maybe 6 months to where we are now. In terms of the parties themselves, I mean, yes, however, I believe there's some division within the coalition themselves over this. I mean, bear in mind, we have a Green Party integration minister who has been landed with this since the coalition took office in 2020. And the problem has gotten worse. His department is not properly resourced. The Department of Housing, and obviously in your package there, people will be pointing to this issue being a symptom of the housing crisis. The Department of Housing, while they will assist the Department of Integration, Department of Housing currently led by Fianna Fáil, they don't really want any hand actor part in it. So it's really been left to the Green Party Minister in Integration. And really up until recently, until the Taoiseach Simon Harris took office, Fine Gael were taking quite a hands-off approach, i.e. let the other two parties at it. So yes, I mean, I think there does need to be a solution, but the numbers coming in, it's hard to see a situation where this is going to be solved in time for, say, June 7th. And this is why these elections are going to be so critical.
What about, sorry to interrupt, we've only got about a minute left with you, Conal. Very different attitudes to border control about this discussion. That's a key issue for Sinn Féin, obviously, and a key problem for the party.
Yeah, it is. I mean, Sinn Féin would say Sinn Féin have been mostly critical of the government's approach to date. That's been their raison d'etre, as it were, and they haven't exactly provided solutions. What they've called for is the Dublin government, the London government, to work together on this, given the number of people coming in from Northern Ireland across the border into the Republic. But this has also led to divisions within Fianna Fáil, for instance. I mean, this week we had Barry Cowan, who's the Offaly TD, who's running in Midlands North West for the party, say that there need to be increased border checks for people coming in to stop illegal migrants, as it were. Niall Blaney, who's also on the ticket with him, then came out and said that these were ill-judged, and he was angered by these comments because we don't want a hard border on the island of Ireland. So this really is becoming a political football at the moment within even individual parties.
OK, Conal, we could talk more about it, but we'll have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thanks very much. Now, just time for a final word with my guest of the day, David Young. David, I don't know about you, but that kind of feeling of a shift over this issue, it's become a really visual, a terrible visual in Dublin, the tents, people being handed, as Conal said there, a tent. I think they're getting a Dunn's voucher, and because there's nowhere to put people.
Yeah, and I think Conal touched on it there. This has put all the parties in the Republic in an uncomfortable position. You know, it's not a case of, you know, the opposition making hay in terms of the government's difficulties. It's put all the parties in a difficulty, and I think what you may see in the elections in June is probably a very good showing for the independents as a consequence of that. For the government, I think their challenge is treading that line and that dilemma as you face between fulfilling your international obligations and adopting a humane approach, but also you've seen in recent times the Taoiseach certainly trying to portray Ireland as being a little bit more firm in regard to this issue, and because I don't think they want to be seen as incentivising people to come to Ireland. And I think what you may see in the weeks and months ahead is a move to potentially reform social welfare allocations in regard to asylum seekers. So
and they're talking as well about really putting resources into turning the applications around much more quickly, some of the narrative that we've heard in the UK as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose it comes down to that this is not just an Irish issue, it's not a UK issue. It's a global issue in regard to the trends we're seeing. So I think in that respect, from the government's point of view, the EU Migrant Pact is a big thing. So then you'll get a block-wide approach to this in terms of trying to turn those applications around quickly and get a more effective way and efficient way of returning people who are potentially not eligible for asylum. Just
briefly then on the SDLP, you're a long-time observer of things up on the Hill. What do you make of their performance in opposition over the 100 days?
I suppose the challenge for them, and it's a difficulty for them, is it's difficult to articulate an alternative vision when you're not quite sure what the vision of the executive is. And in lieu of a programme for government, it's difficult to identify what the executive's priorities are. I think maybe the first 100 days has been that sort of holding period, and now we've got the budget in place. At least we'll see departments making decisions for therefore the SDLP to be able to articulate an approach that they might do things differently.
Plenty to look out for. David, thanks very much. That's all we have time for today. The View will be back on Thursday evening. From everyone on the programme team, thanks for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.